Okay, so before we start with the animation, if you want to follow along with this, and you've not followed the previous chapters where we built the robot and we rigged the robot, you can actually download it from the members area at 3d-illusions.co.uk. So if you go into the members area, you can download the robot that's fully rigged and ready to start animating, including the rest of the course files as well. And if you just want it for a single month, it's $3.99 if you want to do hit and run. And it comes with loads of other stuff. We've got all the scene files for the various different projects we've done throughout the years on YouTube. So all these different videos, you're going to get the scene files and the things for those as well. So there's lots of content, not just for this course. So anyway, let's crack on and we'll start animating the Hadoken. Hadoken! Alright then, so let's start animating and make sure you've only got your IK bones visible and also the finger bones as well. So turn on the layers for the IK, which is this one in my case, and the fingers live in these two end ones. Or in Blender 4, I'm just going to turn on the IK controllers here, and the right fingers, these ones here, and the left fingers, where have I put those? Where are those? Left fingers. So I've just got these three collections turned on so that I can control just the bits that I need. Let's go into pose mode. And we'll start animating in IK only. We are going to look at different ways of animating as well. We're going to do initially just a very simple IK only animation, and then we'll look at doing a walk cycle, and then we'll do a walk cycle that follows along with a path, and then we'll also do an animation which takes advantage of IK FK switching. So for example, if I want to change from this controlling the leg to be able to individually rotate the bones, that's called IK to FK switching. It just gives you a bit more control. So we'll do that last, as that's a little bit more, it's not complicated, but it's a little bit more in depth. Alright, so quick recap then what these bones are used for. We've got the foot, which allows us to move the entire leg. And we can also rotate that one on the heel. We've got the toe control, which allows us to tilt the foot up and down on the toe. We've got the pelvis bone, which all of the rest of the rig is parented to, apart from the IK obviously, and that allows us to control the position of the entire rig, like so. And then we've got the waist, which allows us to rotate, the head, which we can rotate, and we can also move that like that as well. We've then got the hands, which we can move the entire arm with, but we can also rotate the hand with as well. And then we've got these pole targets, which tell the elbow where to look. That will rotate the entire arm. And we've got the same for the knees. If we move this, then the leg will rotate and the knee will continue to look at that pole target. Alright, so let's bring up a timeline. Now we need to set an initial key pose where the character's animation is going to start from. So we can obviously, we've looked at before, if we move something where we want it, move the bone where we want it, we can press I to bring up the insert keyframe menu. Now in Blender 4, if you're not getting that menu pop up when you press I, if you're just getting a keyframe straight away, it's because we've only changed the key map for object mode. We've not changed it for pose mode, which we're in now, as we can see there. So we're going to Edit, Preferences, Key Maps, and we'll search for Insert Keyframe. And you can see we've got one here for pose mode, and then we've got one below it for object mode, which we've already changed the operator for. So let's go over here. We'll copy this one, in fact, Control C. We'll go to the pose mode one, and I'll paste this in. Make sure you press Enter so it applies it, and then we'll go to save those preferences so that it always applies. And we'll close that down, and now if we press I, we should get that menu pop up. Now sometimes you don't always want to be presented with this option because it can become a little bit tedious after a while. So to automate this, we can choose beforehand which aspects of the bone we want keyframes to be created for. We can get rid of this little annoying window that pops up as well every time you do something. So you're going to View and turn off Adjust Last Operation. That will get rid of that. If ever we need it, we can just press F9. That gives us a bit more space to work with. So instead of doing that, we're going to go, and we'll just undo this. And we'll go into the key in, and we can choose beforehand which keyframes we want to create. So click in this box and choose location and rotation. I'm never going to want to choose to animate the scale of a bone, otherwise we're just going to get weird results like that, which you know, you might want, but in this particular video I'm not going to be doing that. Next, we've got the auto key option. So if I don't enable auto key, now that I've put the key inset in here, every time I press I, it won't give me that menu. It will just create the keys for whatever I've got set in here, location, rotation. So just to expand this, we can see we've only got location and rotation keyframes are created. Now with the auto key option, we don't even need to press the I button. Turn this on. I'll just delete these keyframes initially. I don't want this here. There we go. So if we turn this on, make sure I've still got my key inset, yeah. Now when I move the bone, we're automatically going to get the keyframes created, again, for whatever we've got set up in here, but only, you'll notice in this scenario, it hasn't. It's created ones for scale as well, which I didn't want. And the reason for that is, we need to, in here, in this little drop down, say to only use the active key inset. And this time, when I create a movement and let go of the mouse, it will create the keys for us, but only for what we've got set in here. Alright, so let's create a start pose. I'm just going to move these bones into a, I'm thinking of doing something like maybe a Hadoken. And basically just move the bones around until you get a start pose that you like. And don't forget as well, you can make use of the 3D cursor. So for example here, I wanted to get this into roughly the right position by rotating. So I put the hand on the lap, but then I rotated and it went through. Now what I can do instead is change the pivot point. So if I put the 3D cursor at a point that I want the rotation to pivot around, I can then change the pivot point to 3D cursor and it will rotate around that point there. Just makes it a little bit easier. Just make sure as well, obviously, change it back afterwards. And be careful not to get your arms completely straight, otherwise it's going to confuse the IK system and you're going to get weird snapping during the animation. Alright, so that's a good start pose. I need to make sure as well that I also add a keyframe now for every single bone. So I'll select all the bones and I'll press I, and that's going to add a keyframe for us for all of those selected bones, so all the visible bones. And of course I need to just work on the fingers a little bit as well. So that's actually alright, but I could probably twist these thumbs a little bit, the thumb bones. So let's select these two bones here, and I'm going to do RZ, make sure on the local axis, and make sure the pivot is set to individual origins. This will make sure that both bones rotate around their own origin and not around some point in space. So RZ, they'll both rotate then independently until the thumb is in place, and then the end bone, we can rotate that one. Make sure you choose Z again. If you don't choose the Z axis, what's going to happen is, when I rotate that some other way, we're going to get the model breaking. It's a good idea in actual fact to prevent that from happening by locking those channels. So let's select all of the finger bones. So in your bone groups, what you set up earlier, select the fingers, the thumb for both hands, or in Blender 4, of course, we can do it in the bone collections in the armature tab. So just choose the collection, click select, and then we'll choose the other fingers. So left fingers and click select. That's the same thing as bone groups. So I won't keep repeating this. This will be the last time I'll show you. Just be aware that whenever I use bone groups to select things, you're going to be doing it in the bone collections if you're in Blender 4. And then go into the item menu up here, and we've got the rotation. Now, these rotate around the Z axis only. Any other axis is going to break the mechanical pieces. So with the Alt key held down, drag the mouse over W, X and Y, and that will make sure that all of the bones are now locked on those axes. It's a good idea. We'll do it for the location as well. So Alt drag, like so. The Alt key basically tells Blender to change the settings for whatever you change in here for all selected bones. Without the Alt key, it will only change the settings for the currently active bone, whichever one of these bones is yellow. So if I choose these bones now individually, you'll see they're all locked. And now I can't accidentally rotate them in the wrong direction. So if I try and rotate this now in the wrong direction, it's just going to rotate on the Z in some form. So again, I'll select the thumb bone, and I'll just rotate that in. And for this hand, I'm going to select all these finger bones. I don't want this one though, so I'll B, middle mouse, wheel held down, and deselect that one. And now if I rotate these on the Z, just to give a bit more of a natural look to it. And this is the new start pose now. I've made those changes to the fingers. So I'll select all the bones again, just to be safe, and I'll press I, and that'll add a keyframe for that. All right, so let's continue, and we'll add all of the key poses, and then we'll work on the timing after. So the key poses are basically the poses that the character must have during a motion, and also the pose at the end of each motion as well. So let's start off, and we'll go to the next frame, and we'll just initially do one every 20 frames, and then we'll work on the timing afterwards. So I'm going to do something like the Hadoken, and we'll bring the character back now to the back of the Hadoken, or sort of the wind up to the Hadoken. So maybe we'll start rotating now. So this is midway towards the end, to the back of the Hadoken, where it's building up the power. And make sure you create a keyframe for every single bone. So select all the bones and press I. So that's that one. And then we'll go to the next one. This is going to be the very back of the Hadoken. So we'll bring this character back even more. And rotate as well. Maybe we'll just do it on this one. And if you're not sure, just do it with your own body or take a video of yourself doing it. I just did a Hadoken right there in my chair. I'll start with the hands, and then I'll use the pole targets to get the elbows into the right place. And then select all the bones and add a keyframe for each by pressing I. And then next, we'll come forward to the very end of this time of the Hadoken. Select all the bones and do a key pose for those as well. So let's play this back. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. It's very slow, obviously, so a bit more like Tai Chi than a Hadoken. So I'm just going to make sure I've got all the bones selected in the viewport. And then I'm going to, let's go to the dope sheet, in fact. Just so we've got a few extra options, like select options if we need them. And we're going to drag the summary, so all of the bones, all of the keyframes for all of the bones, using this top one, we'll just drag this across. And that'll make sure that we're changing the entire animation, the entire rig. So let's play that back. A little bit too slow still, maybe a couple more frames. Still a little slow, so let's just bring it one more frame. Yeah, that's looking good. And then we're going to have a, in fact, actually, it's off balance if I look at it from the side. So I'm just going to grab this foot and drag this forward on the global Y. Let's try that. And for the next key pose, we'll do the recall. So move forward to frame, 58. We can always move it later. I'll bring this foot back. I want to bring the foot back to the same position, I think. So I'm actually just going to select the foot bone and I'll copy this one here where it's in the original position. So I'll grab this key here, Shift D, copy that across. That'll make sure that the foot slides back to the same place as before. And then we'll just continue moving and rotating the bones to get them back into position at the back end of the recall. I think actually on this one, I'm going to rotate these so they're facing forwards more at the front of the Hadoken. So I'll just reset the rotation with Alt-R. I'll do the same for this one, Alt-R, so they're looking forwards. And then just modify the hand position and things just to accommodate that change we've made on the waist. And then finally, I'll bring in the entire pose. I'll copy the first frame onto the last frame, so Shift D. Bring that across. So it goes back to the start pose. So it finishes on frame 67, basically. It's back to the first pose. So I need to make sure that the frame length is, the animation length is one less. If I want it to be, a loopable animation. So I'll go over here and I'll change this to 66. Let's play this back. And we'll just look for problems as well. So obviously the first problem is the hand's penetrating at the beginning there, and then it's going through the boob. But other than that, looking pretty good. So we've only got to fix this hand, basically, where it goes through the leg at the beginning there, and also where it penetrates that boob. And there's a little bit of a flick on the elbow as well. Right, so let's fix the beginning first. Let's zoom out a bit on this. Now we've got a few options how we can do it. We could add a new keyframe, which is probably the best bet in this scenario. Generally, you don't want to add too many keyframes because it will make your animation look jerky. But there's quite a big gap between these, so I don't think there's any problem here of adding a new keyframe for this hand, just a bit further across. Or alternatively, if we want to keep it as smooth as possible, in this pose here, we could in fact bring this arm more across, like this. Maybe a bit higher. So that the arm, instead of going through the leg, it goes straight up basically. And then it shouldn't penetrate the leg then. So that's one option. And that will be the smoother option. So let's just have a look at that. We might want to bring the elbow in a little bit. Yeah, maybe to about there. Make sure you're on the key pose. Let's try that. No, I don't like that. So I'm going to undo that. So we'll go with the first method instead. So I'll bring that arm across a little bit and I'm going to rotate it this way. Let's try that. Yeah, that's better. And now obviously here, we've got the problem of, well, the first problem is the elbow goes inside the body. So we need to make sure on this keyframe probably that this is a little bit further out. So let's fix that. In fact, that may have fixed both issues. We've got a little bit of a slight going through there. So what I'm going to do on this one is bring this a little bit further forward, both of these hands, so that they don't need to penetrate that boob on the way there. Let's try that. There we are. That seems to have fixed every problem we've got. So let's just play it back at full speed. So at the end there, we've got a little bit of a pop on this arm. If we just go to there, just there, look at, you see the arm goes completely straight. So it's going to pop back into place at some point during before it reaches the next keyframe. So we just need to make sure that that doesn't happen. So on this keyframe, on this key pose here, we just need to bend that arm a little bit. So select this hand. I'm just going to bring it up just a tiny bit until that straight arm disappears. And if we try that now, it's still going straight there, so we didn't bend it quite enough. So we get up a bit more. And that's fixed it. And obviously that is only something you need to worry about if you're animating with IK. With FK, you can have your arm straight wherever you want because you've got complete control over how the bones rotate in that scenario. So the next thing to do is, now we've got the key poses sorted out and we've fixed a few of the issues, is work on the timing and just make the animation a bit more realistic. So the first thing I want to do is make the animation a little bit less jerky, because at the moment, if we look at these keyframes, all of the bones have got a keyframe on the same frame. So on frame 1, frame 11, we've just got the hand where we made that amendment, but otherwise, frame 20, 40, 50, 58 and 67, basically they're all starting and stopping at the same time, which looks rubbish. So as you can see, it's just like, there's no overlap in the animation, which is necessary for a realistic render, for a realistic animation. So we'll start thinking now about which bones we can move in at different times. Right, so let's select all the bones and we'll look at the keyframes we've got. And we'll think about which are the most obvious parts where things would move at a different time. And I think the hands would probably not start moving, and the hips would start moving first. Now, this is going to cause a few problems, but it should make the animation look a little bit better. So if we just select the hip, and we'll bring that forwards on the timeline so that the hip will actually start moving before the hands, it will introduce a few problems, but you'll see now the hips start moving very slowly, and now the hands will start moving behind, which is leading now to overlap here, because obviously the hands are moving a little bit slower than they were before, or they're a little bit behind the rest of the animation than they were before. So we need to fix that now, but we'll just make sure we got that hip right to start. Could probably even bring that hip a little bit further back. Let's try that. So I think already that's quite a big difference. It's subtle, but it's definitely there. As you can see there, it's much better. So we didn't need to fix that thing with the hands now. So I'll select both of these hands. And how can we fix this? Let's have a look. So, well, obviously one way we could do it is to put another keyframe in, but I always try and avoid that if I can, because as I said before, it makes a jerky animation if you're putting too many keyframes in. I just want it to be one fluid motion from the back to the front. I don't really want to put another keyframe in, which will then sort of impact the smooth flow from the back to the front of the Hadoken. So instead of doing that, what I'll do, with the hands both selected, I'll hover my mouse over the graph editor, or the dope sheet, and I'll press Ctrl Tab, and that'll bring the graph editor up, just for the selected bones. So we need to figure out now which of these channels, which of these curves, we need to modify in order to get the hands to move forwards on the global y-axis. And this all depends on what you've got the bone settings at. So if I, with the hand bone selected, I'll go to the bone settings over here, and you can see it's using a local location. Now that doesn't mean the current local location, so you might think this is pointed in the y direction, so I probably need to move it a bit on the y and the x to get it to come this way. But in actual fact, this means it's the local location when in rest pose. So to find out, if you go across to the bone properties, the bone data properties, turn it to rest pose, and then we can see that both of these hands are actually aligned on the y-axis with the global y. So if I choose this one, make sure it's set to local up here, you can see that this local Y in rest pose of this hand is pointing that way, same as the global Y, and so is this one. So we just need to modify the Y channels in order to get those hands to move forward. Now, if you don't have those ticked, so if you've got it unchecked here, it means it's using the current local location of the parent bone. So in this case, the parent bone for these hands is actually, if we check, the bone 004, which is this one here. So this is the main rig. So we can check that by making sure we're still in local. And if this would have been unchecked, then we would need to modify the Z channel of the hands in order to get them to move on the global Y. So hopefully that makes sense. I usually leave it set to local location. I've not really had much of a need to ever use the parent space. But either are fine. It just changes how they're represented in the graph editor so that you know which one you need to modify to get a specific result. So now we know it's the Y location we need. To make it a little bit easier, we'll isolate the Y location keyframes. So if we go in here, you can see we've got for both hands, we've got the Y location on the left and the Y location on the right as well. So I'm going to select both of these and then I'll shift click this one. And I'll just in the options choose to only show selected curve keyframes. And that means that whatever I've got selected in here, they're the only keyframes we're going to see. And that'll just make it a little bit easier. And a very slight change in Blender 4, instead of using shift click, we use control click. So I'll click on the Y location here, control click this time on this one. If we do shift, it's going to select them all in between. It's been updated so that it's got the same functionality as the outliner where you can shift click a selection. So control click instead, click this one, control click this one, and now we've no longer got the show selected keyframes only option. So what we'll do instead in Blender 4, which is probably better, and I believe it also works in Blender 3.6, is to choose to hide the unselected ones. And we can either do that in the channel menu, we can say hide unselected, or the shortcut Shift H, or we can say hide the selected, which you probably wouldn't normally want. And then you've got the ability to unhide using Alt H. So I'll do it with the shortcut. I'll press Shift H, and now we've only got those ones visible. It's basically turned off the eyeballs for us of the unselected ones. And then when I press Alt H, we've got those back. So that's how you would do it in Blender 4. And I believe that works in Blender 3.6 as well. So you might prefer to use that method. So let's extend this out a bit. So basically what's happening, this is showing the Y direction. So it starts high, which indicates on the right. And then it goes low, which indicates that value, that Y location value, is decreasing as it goes into a negative value over here. So you can see it's going from 0.5, which is around about here, to negative something like 0.7 or something like that, which is going to be where it finishes over here. So what we need to do is just here, where it's intersecting, we need to speed this up. So it will still start later, but to compensate for that, it will go a little bit faster. So let's select these keyframes where it's going to finish, and we'll set these handles. In order to do that, we're going to have to turn on the handles all the time. So in the view menu, untick only selected keyframe handles, and then we can see all the handles all the time. So grab these, I'm going to just move them on the x-axis to the left, so that the line indicates that we're getting to this point much earlier than we were before. Let's play this back. It's much faster. We are still getting a bit of a problem there. So we might actually have to move the hands a little bit forward. And we can either do that by selecting them and moving them manually, or while we're in here, we can actually just set these two here that shows the value on the y-axis of where these hands are, and we'll just move them both this way, which again is going to be in the negative direction. So we'll just bring those down so that at the start of the motion, we're not actually overlapping already. And let's try that. And there you go, that's fixed that problem. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. So let's just have a look at the impact that's had on the animation. So you can see we've got the hips now leading the beginning, they're sort of instigating the forward motion and the hands are following behind. So it's sort of catapulting the arms along before these start accelerating for a bit more of a realistic animation. And we can do this with all the other bones as well. As long as we don't mess about, just go back to the dope sheet, select all the bones. We just need to make sure, if we want to keep this loopable, that we don't mess about with the start and end poses. We can do anything in between, and that'll be fine. So we'll probably look at the head next. And we can just offset this a little bit. So I'm going to just grab them randomly using just the summary. Let's just collapse it. And we'll just move these around a little bit randomly. I'm not too worried about giving it much thought, to be honest, but when you're doing it, if you want to get a really nice result, you can think about which bones would start moving first, like we did on the hips here when we decided that the hip would probably start catapulting the arms along to instigate that forward motion. But as long as they're not going all at the same time, we're going to get a much nicer result. And the foot as well. I don't really want this foot to start moving at identical time to the hips, which it shouldn't be actually because we've changed the speed of the hips. So that might be okay. Yeah, I think that's all right. But here, this is a bit of an obvious, looking a bit weird. This foot moves out exactly the same time as these hands start coming down. So everything's static, and then quite unnaturally, those hands and the foot start moving at precisely the same time. So I'll go back to the frame where that foot starts moving, and I think I'll delay that a little bit. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to move it, oh, not all of them, make sure you only select the one you want. I'm going to bring that forward a little bit so it starts moving much later. So now the hands start moving, and then the foot comes across a bit later. And also here, when it comes back, the hands and the foot start coming back at the same time, so that looks a bit unnatural. So I'll take this foot here, and let me think about this. Which would I prefer to come back first? Maybe bring the foot back first, so that would indicate we'd need to move this one back a little. Right, and that adds a bit of a offset to those. Let's just see how that looks. And also, rather than it just sliding on the way back, I think I want it to lift up. So halfway back, I'm going to lift this up in the air a little bit, just a tad, and maybe rotate it as well on its local X. Let's try that. And then this foot at the end, let's grab this one. I don't like how that's just sliding across. I think this foot should finish its motion before this one starts moving. Otherwise, it's just like you're doing like they're doing the splits, the inverse split, which just looks weird. So I'm going to wait till that foot gets back to its next keyframe, which is using the up arrow, this one here. And so I know this one here, I don't want that to start moving until this frame. So we'll grab this frame here where it starts moving, put it back to where it was, maybe even one after, so this one gets a chance to settle properly. And then you've got more of a pull it back, get your balance again on that foot, and then bring the other foot across. The next thing I want to look at is some follow through. So unlike having too many baked beans, a follow through in animation is where at the end of a motion, if the motion suddenly stops, any children of the object that has come to a sudden stop will keep moving briefly afterwards. So they'll all stop at different times based on how small they are or whereabouts they're attached. For example, if you put something at the top of a car aerial and then slam the brakes on, that thing at the top will stop moving last. It will continue swinging around. And I'm just going to demonstrate because I've realised now that probably a lot of people don't know what a car aerial looks like because nowadays they put them inside the car out of view. But it's basically this little bit of wire on top of the car which is attached to the car body. So that when the car body comes to a stop, just play this back, watch the aerial, you'll see we get a bit of follow through motion where this keeps moving after the main parent objects stops. So this is what we want to emulate in 3D as well. So we'll do the same thing with the hands, and all we need to do to achieve this is we'll select both hands. On this frame, this is the one where the animation comes to a stop, and I'll just make sure I select all of them, Shift D, and now at the end of this motion, it's going to stay completely still, and what we can do is just add a little bit of extra motion to these hands on the second frame. So we'll rotate those around a bit, and now this is going to give the impression that the hands are continuing the motion after the arm stops, like that. And if you want to as well, we can offset these slightly. So I'll just select one of the hands, maybe the back one, and bring that across a bit more. And now they're going at slightly different times, just for a bit more realism as well. And then we'll do the same thing with a few of the other bones, obviously, the other children of the main pelvis. So we've got this waist. If we go to, let's go to the frame where the end of the Hadoken finishes. And I'll just copy this one. I'll insert a keyframe for this one. And then we'll go a few frames ahead. And we'll copy this across so that it stays static. And then we'll just give it a little bit of a rotation. And that will add a bit more movement there to indicate sort of a reaction to that sudden stop of the pelvis. And lastly, we've got the head as well at the top. So I'll do the same thing for this. Let's just check which frame it starts. So end of the backswing, 58. I think we'll put a keyframe here. So to make sure we've got the pose where it stops. We'll copy this one completely, Shift D, and then we'll just rotate it just a tiny bit. I think that was a bit too much before. There we are. Subtle, but it still makes a difference. And then the last thing, so we'll move this foot a bit earlier. So let's bring that in. And let's now see how this looks. So at the end, because we've moved it earlier, we're actually off the floor now. So I'll just need to move this foot back a little bit. Make sure you've got auto key turned on to about here. Let's try that. So that's better. This is now moving earlier than the pelvis. It just makes it feel a little bit more natural. And lastly, we'll move on to some secondary motion. And secondary motion are the sort of micro movements that we make when we're standing still, for example, or where you might be moving your weight from one foot to the other subconsciously, or you might be just moving your head around a little bit without thinking about it. So we'll add some of those sub movements to it, just to add a bit more polish to the animation. And we're not going to mess about doing it by keyframing each and every sub movement. That would take forever. Instead, we're going to use the animation modifiers to do it automatically for us. So we'll choose the bone that we want to add some of this micro movement to. I'm going to start with the pelvis because that will add a bit to the children bones automatically, obviously. So we'll choose the X location. And we'll go into the graph editor and we'll go into the modifiers tab over here. Press N if you don't see this panel, and then we'll add a noise modifier. So the noise will modify the existing shape of the keyframed F curve that we've got. So if I just turn that down, you'll see it's still following along, but it's just adding a little bit of noise to it. So let's play this back. And obviously that is way too jittery. So at this point, we probably want to change the scale. So let's turn that scale up so that it's much slower now, but it's way too much still. It's moving too far away from its intended location that we keyframed. So we'll turn the strength down even more until it's much more subtle. And then we'll do the same for the other channels, because at the moment we're only doing that on the X location, the local X axis of this bone. So what we'll need to do is do the same for each of the other channels as well that we want to have a little bit of movement on. So rather than going through all that again, I'm just going to click this icon here to copy them. And I'll click this one and I'll paste that in. I'll do the same for the Z as well. And if you wanted to, you can do it on the rotation. It's completely up to you, whatever you think looks best. So one thing to bear in mind though is, you don't really want them to be all happening at the same time. We've put the same noise on each of these channels. So the noise pattern will become perceivable because it's all happening on the exact same frame, the same noise shape. So to fix that, we'll just use the offset on each of them, just to offset them from each other so that they don't happen simultaneously. And you don't have to do these one at a time if you don't want to. So if you select all 3 channels, so if I select all 3 of these, we'll add a new modifier, do the same again, noise. It's actually going to add them the same noise to each of those, and then you can just select the channel you want to modify and then change the, the strength or the offset or the scale of just that one. So that's a quick way you can do it. Now, you can't choose all 3 in Blender 3.6. Press Alt and then drag to affect them all. Whereas in Blender 4, we can actually do that. So I've got them set up for all 3. I can now hover over one of the properties and press Alt, and now we can actually affect all 3. So that's a bit of an improvement in Blender 4. It might just be 4.1, I'm not sure, but in some version of Blender 4, they've added this functionality to make it even easier to modify, multiple modifiers. So back in Blender 3.6, we do have one problem, and this is that because this is a looping animation, now that we've got random values applied to this curve, it's no longer exactly matching at the beginning and the end of the animation. So to fix that, we'll just use the restrict frame range on each of these. So go in here, we'll click restrict frame range, and I'll just say start on frame 3 instead, and we'll end on frame, 65. So not quite at the end. And then we'll use the blend in and blend out. Let me just show you what this is doing, in fact. We'll turn the strength up temporarily. Right. So we can see here, we've got the start, which is on frame 3. So that's here. And then the end on frame 65, which means now these start and end points will once again be identical. It's a little bit at the moment, a little bit too, it's a sudden bit of noise jumping in. It's going to be very abrasive. So we'll just add a little bit of blend, so it blends in much more smoothly, and we'll do the same on the end as well. And there we are. Now, because I recorded this in Blender 3.6, I'm going to quickly copy and paste these modifiers onto X, Y, and Z again, so that I don't have to do that restrict frame range procedure on all 3. So I'll just do that very quickly. Again, in Blender 4.1, you don't need to do that. You can just use the Alt key to turn restrict frame range on for all 3, and then modify all of those start, end, blend in, and blend out properties for all 3 at once. There we are. So we've got a very small amount of sub movement in there. We'll probably do the same for the head as well. So choose the head, and just for speed, I'll choose the, I think we'll do it just on the rotation this time. So the rotation, I'll paste the same one in, and I'll do that for all 3. And then this is way too much now, obviously, for this one. So I'll just go back in here, and I'll change the strength to something like 0.01. And same for this one, maybe 0.02. And this one, 0.01. So it's in there, it's very subtle, but it's definitely adding a little bit more sort of motion to it, which sells the character a little bit more. So I think we'll call that it for this first animation. The next one we'll do, we'll look at the walk cycle, and then we'll do a walk cycle along a path as well. So we can see how we can get the feet to sort of not look as though they're sliding around.